he asked if I was going to introduce, and then he said I could say that. Here's Johnny. So, John Casti, here you go.
Thank you. Okay, Brenda, thank you. Nobody's called me Johnny for about maybe 65 years.
Well, you should feel young again then.
I always feel young.
Yeah, I know. I thought
For a
of
while.
that as I was saying.
Okay, yesterday when I talked about the book that Roger and Michael and I put together that led to the creation of the X Press, I forgot to show you what the book actually looks like. This is the cover of the book, and I happen to like this piece of art, and so acquired the rights to it for the cover to the book. I think it kind of, at least in my mind, evokes a sense of complexity as being something that we should be aware of. There are some dangers, and you're going to see in this talk today, there are some big dangers in too much complexity. Too much complexity looks a lot like whatever you're thinking in your mind that this thing looks like. Lots of claws, lots of sharp teeth, and it can do you a lot of harm. But at the same time, like anything that can do you a lot of harm, there's a flip side. It can do you a lot of good too, if you understand it and have some sense of how to manage it. Okay, so I hope that you will see this cover in every bookshop in the world soon, but I'm not holding my breath waiting for that to happen. Okay, so let's go on to the actual topic that I want to discuss today. I told you yesterday I did a couple of books in the last few years on mass psychology and on complexity overload. And they were, even though they were for general readers, they didn't have much technical stuff in them at all. But they had some ideas that I think most people would look at and say, gee, this looks kind of interesting, but it looks pretty academic, pretty kind of speculative in some sense. And so since that time of these publications, I somehow got engaged with a hedge fund operation here in the U.S. who said, well, listen, maybe these ideas could be translated into some kind of operational terms, that we could use them as the basis for an extreme events fund. A fund that would actually trade not on price movements, but dig a little deeper down into the system and look at what is it that's creating those price movements. And fundamentally what creates them are events, or perceived events, beliefs, even more beliefs than necessarily actual events themselves. And I thought, well, that sounds like an interesting challenge. I'm not sure that it can actually be done, but I'm certainly ready to give it a try. And so what I want to report to you today is a little bit of what's happening in that direction, in that space, with this general idea. But in order to do that, I first have to have a couple of preliminaries, because unfortunately, I'm afraid that it's the case that not everyone in this room has read those books. And it's rather deplorable, but nevertheless. Yeah, so here's a picture of one of them, just in case you might want to dig a little bit deeper. This is what it looks like. The second one, the Xevents. Okay, so the first item on the agenda is, what do we mean by an event? And in fact, an event is really nothing but a change of state. Any change of state constitutes an event. So for example, if you say, well, the current state of the weather, we can characterize it by looking at the wind velocities, temperature, humidity, and a few other quantities. You have a list of numbers. That's the state of the weather today at this moment. And if any one of those numbers changes, then the state of the weather has changed, and that change is an event. So an event is simply a change from the current situation, whatever it is, to something else. So in fact, events are going on all the time. You know, you go back and get a cup of coffee, that's an event. You go over to the men's room, that's an event. You pick up your pen and decide to write something on a page, and that's an event. And if you picked up a pencil, it would be a different event, and so on. So events are what constitute the action, if you like, of everyday life, are events. So, but not all events are especially interesting. In fact, all of the ones that I just mentioned are very uninteresting events. And our attention usually gets attracted to events that have some kind of actual interest. Because, in fact, I can tell you that essentially the vast, in fact, overwhelming majority of the time, we're in a situation where whatever is the current trend in a particular area, doesn't matter whether it's stock prices or weather or whatever, if you ask the question, well, what are things going to be like in the next time period? The answer is almost always to say, it's going to be just like now, except a little better or a little worse. That's the essence of what's called trend following. And you don't need to pay a ton of money to some futurist to tell you that tomorrow's going to be just like today, except a little better or a little worse, because almost always you're right. If you take the set of all possible time moments and you pick one at random and say, what about the next time moment? The probability is 1 that whatever the current trend is will continue. Doesn't mean it's certain. Probability 1 is not certainty. But there are some thin set of points that if you pick them, tomorrow's not going to be like today. It's going to be the opposite. The trend will end at that point. Those are the so-called critical points. And mathematically you can prove that they are very rare in the set of all time moments. But they are the most important points. That's where the real action is. And those points are the places where you should be willing to pay a lot of money to somebody who can tell you when the current trend is ending and flipping to its opposite. And those points happen to be more or less synonymous with what I call Xevents, shorthand for extreme events. Those critical points. So what I'm interested in is not the normal points, but the critical points. And how do you get some sense of when you're getting near one of those critical points? Now, on this slide, you see the characteristics of human events in general. They're always composed of 2 components, what I call a context within which the event unfolds, and the context determines what is possible in the next moment. And not everything is equally possible. Some things are not possible at all. But the context is kind of like, if you're familiar with quantum theory, it's a little bit like the Schrödinger wave function. It tells you all the things that you might see if you make an observation. But what you actually do see is determined by a random trigger. Something that picks out from that set of possibilities a particular event. And that's what you actually get from the space. And all the other possibilities collapse to 0. So all events have that character. And as far as forecasting and prediction is concerned, I would say, forget about the random triggers. They're random. They have no pattern. They don't have anything you can grab onto to give you an idea of what the trigger is going to do. You know, like, for example, think about, let's say, the Arab Spring a few years ago. The context was the disharmony, if you like, in Tunisia, stress between the government, citizens, and whatever. And what is it that actually set off that Arab Spring? Well, it happened to have been a fruit seller somewhere who burned himself up in the street. And somehow that triggered the entire process that led ultimately to the Arab Spring. But it was not possible to predict that fruit seller was going to burn himself up and set off this whole massive social movement. Fruit sellers probably burn themselves up all the time, and nothing special happens because the context is different. Context is not right for a fruit seller setting on a political revolution. So, okay, this is a story about events. So I think that, and what I focused on is trying to understand how to forecast, if you like, the dynamic changes in the context, because the context is always changing. And what is it that you should look for, and how should you characterize this context? Because what you really want to know is, where am I on that, let's say, landscape? And if you happen to be at a particular moment on the flat part, like this table, and if you're not right on the edge, then hardly any kind of trigger can make much of a change. It just pushes you around on this more or less same level. But if that tabletop morphs into a sharp mountain peak, and you don't know it until you look around and say, gee, where is everybody? You know, I thought that I was on this tabletop, but I'm on the top of this mountain peak. Then even the smallest kind of random trigger, like a fruit seller burning himself off, can send you off the edge, down into some valley. And which valley you actually go into is strongly then dependent on the nature of that random trigger, with directions pushing, and how big the valleys are. So that's part of the story. How the valleys are part of the landscape. And how do you characterize at any given moment what this landscape is actually looking like and how it's changing? So that's the story. And I'm going to give you some ideas on that in a moment. As far as X events are just sort of a relatively small subset of the space of all possible events. And here are the features that I think sort of single out the X events from just the normal events. First of all, the X events are rare. They don't happen all the time. In fact, they happen quite infrequently. Secondly, they're surprising. Now, this means that there's a relative aspect to these X events. There's not an objective characterization of X events. One man's X event may be somebody else's just everyday event. So but the ones that are surprising to a large enough collection of people in a particular domain, they are, the Xness of the event starts going way up. But I should have mentioned, there's not a black or white affair either. It's kind of a grayscale affair. Some events just have much greater Xness than others. And as we all know, there are 256 grayscales, and one of them is white and one is black, and there are 254 in between. And that's enough to get the idea. And then finally, the last feature that makes the X events interesting for human life, human activity, is that when an X event occurs, it has some big human impact. The impact might be lives lost, might be dollars lost, it might be psychic energy lost, a whole bunch of things usually that are lost, not gained. And I can come back to that later. But in general, the kind of X events that we focus on are those that are in some way damaging. Although, in fact, there certainly are many X events that you can look at and say they're positive. You know, the development of agriculture and domestication of animals, that was an X event. And we're still living off of that X event today. And I don't think anybody would say it was negative. But in fact, it's not the kind of thing we usually think about when we talk about X events. Okay, so let me talk now a few minutes about the idea of what I call the drivers of the landscape. I told you this landscape is dynamically shifting at all times. What are the factors that drive that dynamic? And I think there are at least two of them, and I told you yesterday that I wrote one book for each factor. And so the two drivers that I want to talk about, first one is what I call complexity gaps, where you have a system that you're looking at, it might be the political system, the finance system, or whatever, and there are interacting subsystems that generate the dynamic associated with that overall system. And each of those subsystems has its own level of complexity. And just take two of them, for example, and they're in interaction. It might be the financial services sector and the regulators. Well, they each have their own level of complexity. That level itself is dynamically shifting in the course of time. And so that means that almost never are the two at the same level. But one of them is bigger than the other in complexity, or it shifts back, and so on. And the basic idea here is that gap, complexity mismatch, if you like, is a measure of the stress between those two systems. It's a measure of the stress, just like stretching a rubber band. You start stretching a rubber band, you can feel the stress in your arm muscles. And if you foolishly keep stretching it and don't do something to voluntarily reduce that stress, then nature's going to step in and say, well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to reduce that stress for you. And the way nature does it is not very nice. You get a crash, snap, it breaks. So I introduced this idea of complexity gaps in this book, Xevents, as a way of characterizing risk in an environment where you're talking about events that have never happened before, so you don't have any data. But you certainly have risk. And that complexity gap, that stress between the interacting subsystems is a kind of, I call it a surrogate way, a measure of risk. The bigger the gap, the higher the risk is at that moment. So that's one of the two factors that impacts the shifting landscape of the context of events. The second one is social mood. I talked about that briefly yesterday as well. The beliefs that a population holds about its future. That's the social mood. If the population as a group is optimistic about its future, is looking forward to tomorrow, then they're in a positive mood. And on the other side, if they're fearing tomorrow and not looking forward to it at all, they're in a negative mood. And it happens, if you actually dig into this in any depth, you will discover that the kinds of collective events that arise out of that population are dramatically biased by whether the population is optimistic about its future or pessimistic. If they're optimistic about their future, you tend to get events that have the character you might describe with words like happy, joining, globalizing, and so on. And if they're pessimistic, fearing the future, you tend to get just the opposite. You get events, instead of globalizing, you get events that are localizing. Instead of joining, you get events that are separating. Instead of happy, you get events that are sad, and so on. And my book, Mood Matters, has a long list of these polarities, but the point is that if you want to place some bets on what's likely to happen, there's no guarantees. It's like weather forecasting. You know, you can say chance of rain tomorrow is 70%. It doesn't mean that even if you say 100%, it doesn't mean it has to happen, but it's the way to bet. And it's the same way here in terms of mood of the population. If the population is in general pessimistic, and I'm sorry to have to say, that's the dominant mood today, and has been for several years. Roughly speaking, you can look back and say that it probably started around the year 2000, about 15 years ago. We're in a very long negative mood cycle right now. And it shows up in zillions of different ways, and not the least of which is the current American presidential political campaigns. This is a perfect illustration of negative social mood in action. And it's not going to go away by November. So I'm afraid that you have to learn how to deal with it. But if you have some idea about what's happening, you're in a better position to deal with it than just guessing or hoping, especially just hoping. Hoping's no good at all. So in any case, these are the two drivers of the landscape of events. And I just want to say elaborate just slightly on both of them. So let's start with complexity overload, complexity gaps. I first started thinking about this idea. When I read this book called The Collapse of Complex Societies by an American archaeologist named Joseph Tainter, and as you can see, it's not a new book at all. But Tainter, in this book, it's a fascinating book. He wanted to address the question he had seen throughout history. There are many civilizations that have come and gone, and we're just the next one on the list, actually. And why did they collapse? Was there a special set of circumstances in each case, or was there some kind of common cause? That was his question. And what he discovered in the end was there is a common cause. He called it complexity overload. And the basic idea was quite simple. He said every society, every civilization faces problems. And the standard method that you use to address a problem is to, when you find a problem, you create a new layer of structure in the society whose job is to solve that problem. So, for example, when in 2001, when the World Trade Center came crumbling and crashing down, the U.S. government faced a problem. And the problem was terrorism on U.S. soil. And the government did the standard thing. They introduced a new layer of structure. It even has a name. It's called the Department of Homeland Security. And its job was to address the issue of terrorism on U.S. soil. And of course, if you look at the history books, what you discover is that these layers of structure that get introduced to solve or address a certain problem, it tends to be the case that long after the problem has disappeared, that layer of structure is still there. And I'm sure long after the last terrorist goes to terrorist heaven, the Department of Homeland Security will still be beavering away, doing something. And unfortunately, what they're mostly doing is consuming resources. Resources of the society are consumed in maintaining these structures. And of course, the problems never stop. You know, it's not new problems always appear. New layers of structure are added, and at some point, all of the resources of the society are being consumed maintaining the current structures. There's nothing left over for the next problem. So what happens? Well, one of two things happen, and they're both bad. Either the problem is just ignored, or the problem is given over to some part of the structure, some part of the organization that is ill-suited for dealing with that problem. And in either case, the problem doesn't really get addressed. And so at some point, the complexity it becomes so big that the whole edifice goes off the edge, and the society collapses. This is the standard pattern. And I'm sorry to have to say, when I look around modern societies today, I see this same story unfolding. But it takes, a long time. It doesn't happen overnight. But it's the standard story. That's what's going on. So this was what the story in Tainter's book. I changed it only a little bit by adding the idea of two or more systems in interaction. He was only thinking about a single system, the whole society. And so I told you about complexity mismatches. Here are a few examples. Arab Spring, government and the public, Fukushima earthquake, nature versus the Japanese, and so on. So there are a lot of good examples. And when you start thinking in these terms, you look at the newspaper every day and you see many more of these. They're all over the place. Okay, so now let me shift gears to the second driver, the mass psychology, social mood. And in order to make this idea useful in any operational sense, you have to have some way of actually measuring the social mood. How do you characterize it? Now, some people might say, well, you go out and you take some surveys and Gallup polls and all this kind of stuff. Well, I'm not a big fan of surveys and Gallup polls, that's for sure, because I don't think they give you a very good measure of what people are really believing and thinking. People might say anything, and some surveyor comes around. But I'm a lot more fan of what people actually do. People look at their actions and derive some sense of how they're feeling, what they're believing from their actions, not from their words. And so one good way, but it's not a surefire way, and I'll discuss this in a moment, is to just use the financial markets as a measure of the beliefs of the population. The financial markets, essentially, to simplify them a lot, is a place where people make bets on the future. Every person who's taking out a position in a financial market is making a bet about what they believe about the future on some time scale. And if they believe the future is positive and optimistic, in general, they tend to take out positions that a particular stock or market is going to grow. And if they believe the opposite, they take out a position, a short position, for example, that the market is going to contract. And so the collective belief, what the financial markets do, they just gather together all these bets and synthesize them into a single number, change of price. And that change of price is a reflection of the collective beliefs of all the people who are taking out positions on the future with something they care about, hard cash. So it's not a perfect measure. Sometimes people ask me, they say, well, gee, how can you imagine that these handful of traders over down on Wall Street are a reflection of the entire, let's say, American population, 300 million people, and their beliefs on the future? And there are several ways to answer that question, and I've done pretty elaborate versions of them in my book, Mood Matters. But the basic idea is to say, the financial markets, yes, you could say on the surface they're driven by the actions of the traders, but in fact they're not really driven by the actions of the traders, because the traders are just following the instructions of the people who send in their orders. They're more or less executing the orders to a large degree. And furthermore, these traders, at least human traders, I'm not talking about high frequency machine traders, they're not disconnected from the social system. They're part of it. Those traders, they have friends, they read the newspaper, they watch TV, they have beliefs about the future, and so on and so forth. So they are themselves a kind of, let's say, representative of the population as a whole. So that's one of the answers of why a small number of traders can actually influence and reflect a much larger beliefs of a much larger group. Another, and even in my opinion more convincing argument, although it's not quite so logical, is to say, well, if you use the financial market average as a measure of mood, it seems to work. It seems to be in accord with what you actually see in terms of the events that occur. And there are lots of pictures and charts in my book, Mood Matters, to illustrate that point. But there's also a discussion of the fact that it's not a perfect indicator, because for one reason, it's an aggregate measure. It measures, roughly speaking, the whole population. Now, if you want to get some insight into subpopulations and how subpopulations believe about the future or not, might be the women or blacks or some other subgroup, you can't use the stock market, because the stock market has to do with essentially everybody. And Lena and I actually faced that problem several years ago in Singapore. And because we wanted to have a way of measuring the mood of, Singapore has 2 or 3 major subpopulations, the British, the Chinese, and some others. And which one? The Malays, yeah. And so how do you actually extract, what technique can you use? You can't look at the Singapore Stock Index and disaggregate it into what's going on with these different groups. You have to do something different. And Lena actually talked about that yesterday a little bit. What we did was use what's called an image wall. a collection of pictures and asked people which of these pictures reflects your view of the future on, I think it was 1 year, maybe it was 2 years.
Yeah.
And then processed the answer, because the answer is, the real answer, it doesn't have much to do with the picture. It has to do with the statement, why did you choose this picture to reflect your beliefs about the future? And then text mining and a variety of things to extract some meaningful information from that. So that's an alternative, and it's actually described in that book, What Matters, that
Yeah.
exercise. Okay, so here's a, but in my work right now on Xevents Fund, I use the stock market index as a measure of social mood. So now let me shift and tell you about, oops, wrong button. There we go, Xevents Fund. So I told you already what the goal of this fund is, the ultimate goal, if you want to call it that, and that is to derive operational methods for making investments based on anticipation of extreme events. So if you, for example, could have some reasonable belief that a particular kind of extreme event is going to occur in a particular place in a particular time period, you can go into the financial markets and take out a position on the occurrence of that event. The position is not, you don't get paid directly for the occurrence of the event, you get paid for how people react when the event actually happens, if it happens, the likelihood. So, of course, as we know, there are many, many kinds of Xevents. Asteroid impacts, crashes of the internet, political revolutions, and whatever. And not all of them are useful as the kind of events to focus on for a trading fund. And for example, an asteroid impact, that would certainly have a big effect on the world at large, but it's not going to do you much good to have a position on an asteroid impact if it happens, because you'll never get paid off. And in fact, you'll probably be killed off like everybody else. There won't be any financial markets left. So these are not tradable kinds of events. And fundamentally, the only kind of events that are tradable are political or economic events, because they happen relatively often. They don't generally destroy the financial markets, and you even have some kind of databases for many of them. So our focus, the initial focus, is on these kinds of events, political and economic events. And now you can even ask the question: is, well, okay, should I identify the type of events that I'm going to look at, and then look to see, well, what kind of markets would be impacted if such an event took place? That's one way to go. But I think it's an even better way to go is say, look at the markets first. Look at the markets you want to trade in. It might be the FX market, it might be gold, it might be copper or some commodity market or whatever, and say, I want to trade in this market. What kind of events would impact this market?
Very interesting.
And how to, and so that's what I'm doing right now. So here you see the kind of steps that you have to go through. This, it looks like it's a pretty short slide. There are half a dozen elements on it, but each one of them is sort of like a research program all of its own. And so I wouldn't say that they're impossible, but some of them, the further down the list you go, the harder it becomes. And this somewhere on this list is where we stand on this exercise at this moment. So it's actually, I call it a work in progress. And I can't really say a lot more about the details because I'm not really at liberty to say a lot more about the details from the sponsors of the research. The one thing they don't want to do is have the research succeed and be published in in a general journal. That their investment would forbid that, actually. So, okay, now, but let me give you kind of an example to sort of close up this thing. Just to give the general idea. Suppose you talk about an event, a political revolution in Chile. Okay, in Chile. And why Chile? Well, because Chile happens to be one of the world's major producers of copper. And a political revolution in Chile, depending on the nature of the revolution, political revolution is a little bit too coarse, because there are many different kinds of political revolutions. And depending on the type of political revolution, the impact on production of copper may be just opposite. You know, in one kind of revolution might involve all the copper mines shut down. Another type of revolution might be just the opposite. They start producing more copper ore than ever before, like the oil producers. So you have to be a little bit more specific about the nature of the political revolution you're looking for. But the general idea is still the same, and that is that if you go to a country that, like Chile, that has a dominant position in a particular kind of commodity, then disruption of the social order in that place it can have a lot of impact on those markets, at least in the short term. It doesn't necessarily, because people are afraid. This is the essence of what happens in the financial markets. They make trades on the basis of their fears. What they fear is going to happen. Most of the time it doesn't happen. And all of a sudden the trades get reversed in a few hours sometimes, but sometimes not. Another important factor here, and I say this, I think I said it, maybe not, maybe it was on another slide, and that is that you have to be ready to take action. You have to have your plan of action in place long before you ever get a signal. Because you might have to act very quickly in order to exploit that anticipation. And you can't get the signal and then start standing around wondering, what should I do about it? Because by the time you figure out what you want to do about it, the opportunity is gone. Or very often could be just vanishing. So you have to have your plan of action in place so that when the signal comes, you just jump. Okay, so this is the general idea of what's going on in this Xevents fund research. And as I said, it's still call it a work in progress. We haven't made any trades, but we're still working through the steps on that previous slide. So now I want to just close by moving away from this Xevents fund and returning to something I said yesterday. And that is that when I wrote those two books, Moved Matters and Xevents, I said I felt that they were interesting in their own right, but they weren't the whole story. They were part of a much bigger picture. And it took me a couple of years of thinking about it to sort of get it crystallized in my mind what that bigger picture actually looks like. And so I want to show it to you right now. Here's what I think it looks like. And here at the beginning, I told you that in general, whatever phenomena you might be looking at, it's in a trending phase. And here you see the things that change the trend: complexity, mismatch, social mood, bias, and here you even see the covers of those two books. So those two books that I was talking about, this is where they fit into this picture. And so the picture is a lot bigger than what those two books tell you about. Then what happens is you come to a critical point where the trend is changing from the current trend to its opposite. And that means, I call it a change in context. Delta is means change in context. Plus a random shock, the trigger, that then gives rise to an actual X event. And as I said, in general, that X event its effect is to destroy or wipe away a lot of infrastructure and and the rules of the game and so on that have long outlived their usefulness, but that society in general doesn't voluntarily get rid of. It's just stuff accumulates. And so you need to have a kind of act of God, if you like, to force people to do what ultimately is good for them. Like getting sacked from your job or having your girlfriend leave you or whatever it might be. In general, those are personal events, and actually we talked about them in the book with Roger. There was a chapter about that. And then later you discover, gee, this wasn't the worst thing that ever happened to me. It was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it forced you to go out and explore new territory. It forced you to reevaluate what your skill set and options are and how you might use those skills in a completely different context and so on. So these Xevents, as I said earlier, they are the precursor, they're a necessary condition to free up space for innovation, to free up new niches for products, for services, for ideas, and so on. Because without them, the space is all filled. There's no room for the new events to get a foothold. You need to have, like I said yesterday, something like that that asteroid impact that wiped away the dinosaurs and a lot of other creatures at the time, to open up niches, open up spaces for new organisms, new ways of doing business to emerge, which ultimately led to us. So what happens then after the X event runs its course? If you survive it, you're in a position to take part in the rebirth of the social structure, a reconfiguration, if you like. And what happens then? Well, this is great. This is a lot of fun. This is where action really happens. And then what happens, of course, is eventually you go back to the beginning again. And those new structures sort of become the impediments to further progress. And you go through this cycle. I think that the cycle itself is not so circular. It's more like a helix. That there's a third dimension here that you could say, if you're moving up, that's progress. If you're moving down, that's regress. And it's not entirely clear that it's always progress. You could end up with regress as you go around this cycle. So the takeaway messages are that, number one, too much complexity. Complexity kills. Complexity overload kills. Human events cannot be forecast because they intrinsically involve a random trigger that catalyzes, if you like, the event. And the trigger, by definition, is random. It doesn't have a pattern. So it's very difficult to predict something that doesn't have a pattern. Mood biases events, we talked about that. And finally, X events are necessary for rebirth. They're necessary. So we shouldn't necessarily fear them. They're an opportunity as much as a problem. And what I think, people ask me sometimes, they say, well, do you think that we should just then go out and deliberately create these events and deliberately wipe out half of the social structures and so on? And I say, well, not quite, but almost. Because, in fact, we do it already anyway. We go out and burn down parts of forests so the rest of the forest has a better chance of surviving. We do the same thing in agriculture. You know, you plant some tomatoes in your garden in your backyard, you go out there and try and pull out the weeds and throw them away. But why are you throwing out the weeds? Because you want the tomatoes to have a better chance to survive, but the weeds don't see it that way. But you do. And the same thing when you raise animals. You get rid of the ones that are genetically a problem, so that you can get faster horses to run or fatter pigs to eat, and so on. And so then people even agree with that, and they say, yeah, we do that, no question. But what about humans? You think we should just throw away some humans and so that the others have a better shot at the next generation? Well, in a way we do. I don't have time to go into the details, but there are plenty of health insurance programs, for example, that do exactly that. There's no programs that insure you against everything. This is one principle I think you have to keep in mind, and that is it's impossible to buy insurance against everything. No insurance covers everything. So that means that some people are just going to be effectively tossed aside because they are, for one reason or another, uninsured. And now when you think in those terms, just look around at your insurance policies. And it doesn't even matter about health insurance. It might be car insurance or homeowners insurance or whatever. The contracts are so long because they're not insuring you against everything. And they have to spell out all the thousands of things that you're not going to get insured for even if you pay this money. So the fact is there's always risk. There's always risk. Okay, so much for philosophy. So anyway, that's my story for today, and thanks for listening, and I'm happy to address any questions.
May I present the new proof that we haven't even discussed about it? We ran a major study for Ministry of Defense in Finland about social mood, about yeah.
I forgot about that.
Yeah. I'm afraid that I was producing more responsible production than you were, as normally he's thinking and I'm doing.
That's a good
So, but it was really surprising. We did a comprehensive study for 20 years with different kind of methods, and then we followed up people's perceptions in 5 different studies. In 2008, when Finnish GDP dropped almost 9%, 1 year we lost 9% of our GDP. Not a minor incident. I would say that it's extreme event in the economic field. The media was reporting that how people are excited now when they have been dismissed or they are unemployed, when they can go and develop their skills and capabilities and competencies. It was ridiculous when you knew what was going on and when you were looking at the media coverage. We studied the social mood, and it was so ultimately positive that it was really dangerously positive, as we said.
No.
Then and now we saw a dramatic drop. And if you think about what is happening right now, the reaction of people, even for minor incidents, is that they are burning police cars, they are throwing, fire bombs.
Molotov cocktail.
Yeah, that's one exactly. To the houses and everything. Suddenly this nation, do you remember, Thomas, when you said that Finnish riot did look like a campfire? Unfortunately, it's not like that anymore. People are really rioting and they are really violent and dangerous. And we saw all of that happening. And we tried to warn decision makers. Our report was too dangerous. It was never published.
Probably classified.
Yeah, it is. It was turned out to be classified.
So even we can't read it now.
Of course we can. Anyway, so but that tells that this kind of, John said that this is a philosophy. As a matter of fact, it's not philosophy. It is really pragmatic issue that should be taken into consideration. But because it hasn't been part of our cognitive framework, we simply do not want to pay any attention to this. Social mood is, as John said, is defining how social system is reacting on external incidents.
So, totally the similar context. I'm afraid that such the financial indicators are measure of the social mood. Think being rather skeptical. The financial indicators reflect the economic value, economic functionality. While currently the customer's preference has been shifting dramatically from economic functionality to we call the supra-functionality beyond economic value, encompassing the social, the cultural, emotional, the functionality. There doesn't reflect the financial indicators. There should be some misleading.
Well, I would say that first of all, the I'm not talking about general financial indicators like the GDP. I'm talking about financial markets where people are trading securities
Yes.
back and forth. So people are actually making decisions with their money about their belief about the future. So it's not just general financial indicators, it's very specific ones. The equity market.
In Japan, for example, those indicators doesn't reflect the trend in the consumption increase. That's the discrepancy.
But I'm not saying anything about consumption. I'm saying about people's beliefs. How do those market changes reflect people's beliefs about the future?
That's the reflect the people's behavior, primarily the consumption.
Well, it's not. I'm sorry. You must be an economist, because only an economist would
I'm
believe
too.
that.
I'm too. By the way, I'm too.
In fact, what it
Same
reflects,
cloud.
those beliefs are reflected in people's action. They're reflected in the kinds of music that they like in the short term, or fashions that have become popular. In a longer term perspective, those beliefs turn up in the political domain, the kind of political ideologies that a group or a society has. In a longer term perspective, it might even may show up in decisions to go to war or not to attack and so on. Those don't have much to do directly with consumption.
Yeah.
Except maybe it has to do with the kind of clothing that women like or the books that people want to buy.
I think that there is now both are right, but the point is that the structure of consumption, the amount of consumption may not be impacted, but what type of issues people are buying, that makes a sense.
No, I think that's correct.
Yeah.
I think if
So
people
it
have
is,
negative
right.
mood, they tend to not buy what I would call the discretionary items. They still buy food, and they still buy gasoline and so on, things that are necessary for everyday life. But they say, well, I don't think I'm going to buy this brand new pair of shoes right now because I don't really need it, and I'll hold off until I feel more confident about my job or about the future. So I think the consumption pattern should is for sure. No, Sergio?
Thanks, John. I just try to understand a little bit better what I mean, you're stating there, human events cannot be forecast. But on the other hand, if you have to identify, I mean, going back to the model, this is what you are carrying out now, to how far or how close one is of a critical point, a tipping point.
Yeah.
You have to work with some probabilistic models. Now, how do you combine this?
Yeah, well, first of all, you noticed here I put forecast in scare quotes, because what I had in mind when I used that term forecast here is the kind of thing that you think about forecasting like in celestial mechanics, predicting the position of the planet, which we can do very accurately. And what we can't do in the social domain is very accurately. And why can we predict those planetary positions? One of the reasons is that, number one, the rules are always the same. Planets don't change their rules. And secondly, there's not much by way of random triggers that push the planet. It's pretty tough to push a planet around. And so you have long-term, pretty accurate forecasts. But in the social domain, the forecast is that what actually happens is pretty dramatically affected by the random trigger, which kind of valley you get pushed into. So this is why I think that you can't forecast. The forecasting is more like weather forecasting. It's not like celestial forecasting. You can say, well, the likelihood, it's more likely that we're going to get this kind of event than that, and maybe that's enough for trading in a financial market. You don't need to have certainty. You just need to have a sense of how strong is the signal. And so, and I think it's very hard to forecast exactly when you're going to get at that critical point where you flip from the current trend to the next. for the very same reason. This is why I call it, I think we can do something like anticipation. How do you get a signal to say, you're getting near that critical point, the yellow light is on, now you got to start paying attention. That's it. Okay, any other?
Adrian, last question?
I came away from Moti feeling very sort of optimistic, and I come away from you feeling completely depressed.
Maybe we should have flipped the order.
Yeah, exactly. You've told us we're in a long social down mood. You've told us there's no point in hoping. Hoping doesn't help. Lena pointed out that in Finland they started off in a great optimistic mood, and then they went straight down anyway, and now we're burning tyres. And it gets better still, because then we are obviously in a situation where we're very near to the end of the collapse of our civilization, according to your Mr. Tainter. This is all sort of going, oh my God. What you're using it for at the moment, interestingly, is sort of how can we predict the tipping points, or not at what moment the valley is becoming a peak, so we know when we have to do things.
Yeah.
Is there not something we could be doing or should be doing to try and change the shape of the valley to make sure that we're not about to fall off the edge of the cliff?
Well, I think that
intervening, not just using it as a reactive, but as an intervening method of trying to make sure that the whole society doesn't just go off the edge of the cliff.
well, people will often ask me that kind of question, because what it essentially amounts to is asking, should we do social engineering to somehow change people's beliefs or impact people's beliefs about the future? And I think that the history books are full of efforts that different kinds of governments have made at different times to do social engineering. And in general, they've all been pretty dismal failures, because people they resist the idea of being somebody saying, well, you should start believing in the future. You should start feeling that tomorrow's going to be better than today, just after you've lost your job, or you're just. These things have natural cycles, and you can see them in history books. And I think it's a lot more productive to know where you are on these patterns and say, okay, we're in a down cycle. We can expect. It doesn't necessarily mean you can't be a beneficiary of it, but you have to then ask yourself, how can I be a beneficiary of this current trend? Instead of fighting against it, say, I have knowledge. But rather than basically saying, I ostrich-like, I don't want to know. You know, that happens often. People say to me, they say, I tell them something like I said here today, and they say, oh, that's so depressing. And so, listen, I was called in the newspaper the optimist of the apocalypse. Yeah, just a second, Josephine. And so I say, well, would you rather? And then they say, well, this is so horrible, I don't want to know about it. Therefore, it cannot happen. Well, in fact, it's a complete non sequitur. Therefore, it doesn't. Therefore doesn't enter into it at all. These things do happen, and I think it's better to have some understanding and preparation than to just sort of be swept along like on the surface. Yeah. Okay.
Instead of telling people how to feel, how to think, you can influence them. You can do things so that you can build trust, starting to build confidence in people by providing things, doing things like what we discussed here, like to try to initiate this kind of positive cycles and not positive.
I think look, we are always doing things at every point in time.
If we, with the knowledge of certain things cause certain kind of social mood, then you have a better understanding of how.
Well, this is exactly you hit on the most crucial point, and that is that somehow we sense that the social mood, which is the mood of the group as a whole, is somehow driven by what the beliefs are of the individual people who make up the group. Now, and what really counts is the interaction pattern among those individuals. If there was no interaction pattern, there wouldn't be a social group. It's just a collection of individuals. So it's the interaction pattern among these individuals, because it's a very heterogeneous group, and some people in that group have a bigger impact than others. The media or other kinds of people that you listen to, people who write the kind of books you like to read and that kind of stuff. But the fact is, there's nobody who actually knows how what kind of interaction patterns give rise to a shift of social mood? It's unknown. It's unknown. So it's not the case that we know that certain kinds of things make people feel more optimistic or not, because nobody knows how the social mood is actually created. There might be many different, in other words, what kind of interaction patterns do you have to create, and who should be connected in which way in order to give rise to a change of mood. That information, if you had that, that would be worth a fortune. Every publisher in the world would want to know it, and every government in the world would want to know it, and every financial house in the world would want to know it, how I can engineer the social mood.
If people realize such kind of process exists, then they could rethink about their own decision, about how they think, how they feel, how they want to set their goals, and how they do things, because what they do might actually matter more than they think. For example, instead of just thinking, everything's a mess, we're consuming our planet to, we cannot last for another 20 years, and everyone thinks, this is hopeless, then of course things will go downwards. But if some people started to really think, okay, if we have a few more resources, or collaborate on this and that, we can really do things differently and really showcase this, and this would ultimately may grow if more people realize this whole thing. I think this would be quite a...
Yeah, well, what you said, I think a lot of people somehow inherently believe it, but as far as I can tell, there's not a single piece of evidence that supports it as a fact. And I'll give you an example, that it's often the case that a group, as a group, will behave in a way that no individual in the group would behave that way. And things like riots in soccer crowds and so on are perfect examples of that. There are people who go crazy and do things when they're a member of a group that they would never do as an individual. So to reverse that then and say, well, suppose everybody as an individual decides to behave in a certain way, that's no guarantee that that's going to cause the group as a whole to behave that way. The group psychology is not just adding up the individuals. It's a completely different level. And this is why I say nobody really knows how that group psychology is actually formed. It's the biggest unsolved problem, unsolved question, if you like, in this whole domain. How a collection of individuals and their beliefs and interaction patterns gives rise to the beliefs of a group as a whole. So I would recommend that for a good PhD dissertation. In fact, it's probably more a lifetime study, but at the moment, nobody knows how to. So if you don't know if you don't solve that problem, then you can't do social engineering. That's the bottom line.